Foul baiting isn't a new problem in the league. It has been part of the game for a really long time. But what is foul baiting? Is pump faking your defender in the air and then jumping into them foul baiting? You could argue it is, but you could argue it is also bad defense to leave your feet. Foul baiting to me, and I think most people, is making unnatural and non-basketball moves and plays to draw foul. This could be flopping on a charge or a block, or flopping when you feel the tiniest little bit on a shot attempt. This could be kicking your feet out on your jump shot, like the scissor kick of old, or just spamming rip throughs the second someone puts their arm near you. But a lot of people do some or all of these things, but they don't have the title of a foul merchant. So what makes someone into a foul merchant or a foul baiter? And what is the difference between a merchant and a guy who is just great at drawing fouls? Guys like Joel Embiid and Trae Young are some of the biggest foul merchants of the common era, or at least thought of in this way. But what is the difference between them and guys like Jimmy Butler or Dwayne Wade of old? All of these guys live at the line, averaging more than 8 free throw attempts over their prime. But unlike the guys that I brought up at the start, they don't seem to be thought of as the same type of master manipulators who always have the refs on their side and get a very soft and easy whistle. But I don't really know if this is true. Over Wade's playoff peak from 2006 to 2011, he averaged 27 points. 7 of those points came at the line, good for 26% of Wade's total points. Butler from 2018 and on has averaged 23 points per game in the playoffs, 6 of those at the line, good for 26%, just like his Heat forebear Wade. Now let's shift to the Philly flopping duo to see how they stack up comparatively to these guys who are just thought of as great slashers and attackers. From 2015 to 2020, so this is peak Houston Harden, he averaged an elite 29 points per game in the playoffs. 8 of those came at the line, good for 27% of his total points. So not that big of an increase comparatively to Wade or Butler. The narrative around him is so much different. Embiid has put up a pretty poor 24 points over his young playoff career, a pretty big drop off from his regular season numbers, and 7 of those have come at the line, good for a huge 31% of his total points per game. So to me personally, just based off of those raw numbers, it does seem like Embiid is a bit of a foul merchant, especially comparatively to other guys who are thought of as foul merchants like James Harden. But do Wade and Butler not really get the same level of heat as Harden or Embiid for their foul baiting? It's also not really fair, I think, to compare Embiid to kind of guards or wings because they play a different position. So let's compare him to big men of the past and guys who he often gets compared to, like a guy like Patrick Ewing. So over Ewing's 5-year playoff prime that I picked, he averaged 23 points per game. 5 of those were off free throws, good for only 22%, so a massive 9-point decrease from Ewing and Embiid, and only a 1 point per game increase from Embiid to Ewing. But Ewing was never really the scorer that Embiid is, and played a much more heavy post game. A player who I think closely resembles Embiid from a statistical standpoint as well as a gameplay standpoint is Karl Malone. Both were great regular season scorers who got it done kind of the same way, picking and popping, drawing fouls, attacking the rim occasionally. And likewise, both of them also had pretty steep drop-offs in their scoring when it came to playoffs. Malone mostly just in efficiency and not real raw numbers. Malone, over his playoff prime from 88 to 94, he averaged 28 points per game. 8 of those came at the line, good for 28% of his total points. So still a decent chunk less than Joel Embiid, who really does look like the biggest foul merchant so far. But to me, that really is only scratching the surface and looking at very basic and raw numbers. I think a big part of what makes someone a merchant in fans' eyes is how they get their calls and how many quote-unquote soft calls they get. So let's break it down into the types of fouls each player drew and how many. Wade, over that 5-year playoff stretch, drew 247 shooting fouls and converted on 49 and ones over 60 games. And over this peak, he averaged 7 personal fouls drawn per game, good for about 48% or 46% free throw rate. Really solid, but not as crazy as a guy like Joel Embiid, who has a 58 free throw rate in the playoffs. Guys like James Harden also only have a 46% free throw rate, and I think for Jimmy it's only 44%. And just to compare, Wade's 48-49% to other contemporaries of his time, Paul Pierce, another guy who was a great pump faker and mid-range assassin, also averaged about 49% free throw rate over the same stretch as Wade. Joel has drawn 173 shooting fouls and put back 31 and ones over only 45 games. So yeah, a decent drop off between him and Wade, but when you look at like just the numbers of games, it's really not that big of a gap. And Joel has drawn a steady 8 fouls per game in the playoffs, an absolutely absurd amount. Jimmy Butler has drawn 218 shooting fouls and powered through 69 and ones, nice, over 76 games. But he's only drawn a pretty average 5.6 fouls. So once again, nothing crazy, not the biggest increase between him and Wade or him and Joel Embiid when you consider the amount of games Jimmy has played. Harden has drawn 274 shooting fouls and 39 and ones over 73 games for an average of 6 fouls a game. So I just, from the free throw rate numbers, from all the numbers, it's just funny to me that like Harden has gone such a bad label for being one of the biggest, or if not the biggest, foul merchants in the game. But he pretty much has like a similar statistical foul profile to guys like Jimmy Butler and Dwayne Wade, but they are just not thought of the same. For Malone, we only have play-by-play for later parts of his career, so not his prime, but he drew 223 shooting fouls and got 39 and ones while he was older, which is still pretty impressive. But like I was saying, like Harden only draws 0.4 more fouls than Butler and 1 whole less foul than Wade, but he is this terrible foul baiter, and those guys are thought of like hard-nosed slashers who just had to get calls because you couldn't stop them otherwise. You know, like I don't know if you watched this year's final, but Jimmy was clearly looking for fouls almost every single time he drove at the rim, and Aaron Gordon or pretty much any defender was there with him. It didn't matter if they were smaller. I don't remember how many times Jeff Van Gundy and Mark Jackson were on the broadcast talking about how Jimmy really makes the contact and makes the ref have to make a decision. If forcing the ref to make a decision doesn't sound like foul baiting to you, then I don't really know what is. That seems like that kind of encapsulates what foul baiting is. So what makes someone a foul merchant or just a hard-nosed attacker, and I think the casual fans' eyes, casual with quotation marks around it, is some pretty key differences. First is pretty obvious. What is the narrative around the player? Both Wade and Jimmy are thought about as fearless attackers who will go at anybody and talk their shit, which they are, but due to that narrative, when they do stuff that is thought of as foul baiting, they don't get as much flack for it because they're being smart and heady offensive players, which is true, but it's the same shit that guys like Harden do or guys like Embiid do. The amount of scissor kicks Jimmy gets away with on his jump shot, like I've never seen a guy who shrinks his body and kicks his legs out more often on jump shots than Jimmy. Next is, what do you do when you get the call? I think one of the biggest differences between Embiid, Harden, and Butler in the casual fan's eyes is when Butler doesn't get a call, he usually just moves on and keeps playing. But Embiid and James will let the refs hear it every single time they don't get a foul. They were even talking about how Joel and Harden lead in fouls not called according to the Philly statistical system, which I think is just really funny. They are jumping up and down, yelling and screaming, and that for most fans is pretty off-putting. It seems like they expect free throws every single time down, and that's just not fun basketball and makes the game slow as hell. Lastly, and most importantly, I think the biggest difference between being a free throw merchant and not is how you play in the playoffs. Simple, really. Embiid and Harden both shrink come playoff times, and their perceived reliance on easy and soft calls is magnified on the biggest stages. Because in the playoffs, you don't get those kind of ticky-tack fouls. At least everyone likes to say you don't get those ticky-tack fouls in the playoffs, which you don't for the most time, unless you're the Lakers or Jimmy Butler or you're going against the Nuggets. But that's a different point here or there. And because of those things, you know, people are just kind of thought of differently. Now, let's look at, plus their lack of ability to perform on these stages really drive home the idea for fans that these guys need calls and need a soft and easy whistle to win. And without them, they're just not that good. Now let's look at Wade and Butler. Both amazingly great postseason players. Butler is coming off one of the best postseason runs ever, where he led an 8th seeded Miami Heat to the finals. And Wade was able to lead his Heat to the franchise's first ring in 2006 when he was only a young. And when you see that, it doesn't matter to casual fans, once again, quote unquote, that 26% of Wade's or Butler's points come at the line, because they showed up in the biggest of moments. They showed up when their team mattered. And that creates this narrative that, it doesn't matter if they're getting a call, if they're getting the whistle or not, because they're there when their team needs it, which I don't know how fair it is, but I just think that's really pays into the idea of who is a foul merchant and who's not. For my personal opinion, I think Jimmy Butler is a massive foul merchant, just like James Harden or Joel Embiid, but does it in a more aesthetically pleasing way so fans don't hate it as much. I don't think Wade was the biggest foul merchant. He definitely was a master of the pump fake. He was definitely a master of the rip through, so much so that the league had to actually change the rules to help limit or to help defensive players against players like Wade who are just abusing the whistle. But on the same token, Wade also drove and attacked and was one of the greatest slashers of all time, so it makes sense that he got a lot of free throws. And he kind of exists in this like weird gray area where, yeah, he was probably a bit of a foul baiter, a bit of a foul merchant, but he's not as egregious, or at least not thought of as poorly as these other guys, because he was able to show up in the playoffs, and he's just thought of as a slasher, so he gets the whole idea, well, oh, you just couldn't defend him, so you had to foul him type thing. But yeah, I think it's pretty much just like semantics and comes down to personal feelings about who is a foul merchant and who is not. And I think you can argue a lot of players are or aren't, and I think it's kind of silly that certain people get this negative label, or that it's used as a negative label when it's part of the game, and for some players it's a massive part of their game and they get praised for it.